This is from Corinthians 13, 1 to 13. If I speak with the tongues of mankind and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy, going on, or clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions to charity, and if I surrender my body so that I may glory, but do not have love, it does me no good. Love is patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. Love does not brag. It is not arrogant. It does not act disgracefully. It does not seek its own benefit. It is not provoked. Does not keep an account of a wrong suffered. It does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. It keeps every confidence. It believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails, but if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away with. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away with. For we know in part and prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away with. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. But when I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I have been fully known. But now faith, hope, and love remain. These three, but the greatest of all of these is love. The word of God to the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Since we are celebrating the Valentine's Day this week, I decided to talk about love this morning. Everyone lives on love, wouldn't you say? We need love. Everyone desires to be loved. Everyone, in fact, needs to be loved. We are the creatures of love. We live on love. When we are loved, we thrive. When we are not loved, however, we wither. We give one another love, and we receive love back from each other. So how are we doing in this business of loving one another? Why do we see so many people today clamoring for love? Why are there so many people, children and adults alike, deprived of love? In my humble opinion, because they do not receive love, simple as that. Therefore, they have nothing to give back to others. It works the other way around, of course. That is, if you don't give love to others, you don't receive their love back either. So this morning we are going to talk about how we receive and give love to each other. How do you let people know that you love them? How do you communicate your love message to the recipient? You might think, just say it, I love you. But sometimes whatever ways we express our love do not always register in the person's heart in the same way that you meant it. In other words, we need to say the love message in the ways that the other person will surely understand and appreciate it. We need to communicate in the quote-unquote language, same language between us and the recipients. If I say to you, 사랑해요, in Korean, of course, even though I say it 100 times until my face is blue, you still won't be able to understand what I said, because the Korean language is not your language of communication. However, if I say, I love you, by the way, that's the same meaning as 사랑해요. In English, everyone here would understand it, get it right away, simply because That's the language we use in America. It registers immediately in your heart. Folks, the same way, the key is, in loving business, the means of communication, the means to convey our love to each other. Of course, there's more than one language of love, so I would call them love languages, and that's the topic for this morning, the love languages we use daily. Now, before I go on, I must give a proper credit to the person who coined this terminology, love languages. His name is Gary Chapman. He came up with this, his own theory that there are 5 different love languages people use daily. About 20 years ago, me and my wife were listening to an old cassette tape. How many of you remember old cassette tape? Sermon tape by Gary Chapman. The sermon was very entertaining and informational that I took notes of the sermon. And I also put into practice what I learned that day in my marriage relationship, and it tremendously helped my relationship. So my message this morning, once again, is heavily based upon Gary Chapman's message, 5 Love Languages. Even the title itself, it is. I pray that my sermon would help every one of us to strengthen our relationships with our spouses and children and siblings and even grandchildren. When these love languages are practiced well daily, it will improve our relationships with our family, friends, and neighbors, and even co-workers. So let me repeat what I mean by love languages. Love languages are the means of communication to say, I love you to each other. They're the languages that recipient would understand in the ways that they are indeed loved. They are those languages that would instantly register our love messages in the hearts of the recipients. So please note here that Mr. Chapman mostly focuses on the emotional side, emotional aspect of love, and how to practice thereof. In other words, the more important spiritual aspect, such as God's love poured out into our hearts, or love does no wrong to a neighbor, or love your neighbors, those aspects are not covered in his message, and therefore I will not cover them either this morning. So let me begin with something called emotional tank. That represents the emotional aspect of love. Everyone has their emotional tank that is filled up with love. For instance, if someone loves you by saying, you are wonderful, then the level of love in your tank increases. If someone spends a quality time with you, you feel loved, then the level of love in your tank goes up as well. Out of that reservoir, you can give back your love to someone else in your life. See the pattern here in their love languages. People give and take love with each other, building up each other in love and help each other feel loved. When these languages are practiced faithfully by couples in marriages, for example, especially in a troubled one, and their marriages can be healed and even thrive. So let's go back to the 5 love languages. Mr. Chapman identifies 5 love languages, and by the way, they are listed in your bulletin under the sermon title for your information. The first language of love is words of affirmation. Here are some examples of words of affirmation. I love you. You look great today. You did a fantastic job. You are the best, and you're beautiful, and you're awesome. The list goes on. Now, many of us are fluent in this love language. However, some of us are not so good at this, so we often say nothing to our loved ones. Others are so poor on this language that they end up saying the opposite, hurting their children and spouses and so forth. Now, here's one example. One father that I know would say to his son, you no good bum. Let me tell you, this became a permanent scar in the son's emotions for the rest of his life. Here's another example. I don't know how many of you read the book called The Lord of the Rings, or someone watched the movies and so forth. There was a steward of Gondor, and he had two sons, Boromir, and the second one was Faramir. The younger son always yearned for his father's affirmation, yet his father never gave even one single compliment to his younger son. You see, that hurt the relationship. And here, this is another true story. One night, after the political rally on their campaign trail, most of you remember George W. Bush. He on his campaign trail. So after one night's rally, he drove home late with his wife Laura, sitting next to him in the car, and still his truck running in front of his garage. Mr. George Bush asked Laura, "What do you think of my speech tonight?" Laura obviously didn't give him the highest compliment. So Mr. Bush was so upset that he drove his truck into the garage wall. True story, folks. He was so upset. See? Powerful words of affirmation. Now, next one is gifts giving. Now, clearly, this is the language some people are very familiar with. They are the masters of remembering special days and events in your life. They would never fail to give you flowers and cards and presents, or even cooking your favorite food. I know one husband who would save up money for 5 years to buy one diamond ring for his wife on their every 5th anniversary. Even though husband is gone to the Lord now, but the wife so appreciated that practice that she still talks about it each time I see her. For someone who uses this language, if you do not give gifts to her or him, she or he would not feel loved, love deprived, love missing, unloved, and so forth. Gifts giving. The third love language, he identified quality time. I don't have to tell you about the importance of spending time together, out of sight, basically out of mind. When you spend time with your loved ones, be sure to give undivided attention to each other. Now, back in the days, I have known a married couple, both working full time. So every evening, they would sit down, they would eat TV dinners together, watching evening news on TV at their dining table. No communication, both of them tired, nothing to talk about. Sadly, I watched them divorced. Nowadays, I've seen some young couples, communicating with their smartphones, texting each other, even in their beds. That's not good either. Another true story, a son was a star quarterback in his high school football team. His dad, however, never showed up at his son's games, not even once. So folks, next time, if your son wants to play a game or any sport with you, do not refuse and drop everything and play with him. And one thing is for sure, by doing so, you will fill up his emotional tank, and he will remember and appreciate it for a long time. The next love language is physical touch, and I don't have to tell you what it is. It involves, sex and hugs and holding hands and so forth. Now, some of us love hugs, for example. Others avoid hugs by all means, because physical touch is not their thing. But there's a sure merit to it. Here's an example. Even when Jesus gave a special blessing to the children, he didn't just say the word. He laid his hands on their heads, each one of them, and wrapped them around with his hugs. Another story of a lady whose name was Japanese lady Miura Ayako. She was a novelist and a Christian author in Japan. Right after the World War II, in her 20s, and she was still single, she contracted TB, tuberculosis, that attacked her spine, known as the caries of the spine, or pot disease, if you know. Now, because of her condition, she was confined for bed for 13 years, 7 of them in a body cast, that restricted all movement. Now, during this time, she married a wonderful Christian man whose name was Miura Mitsuo. And in her book, she wrote about her marriage life, basically devoid of all sexual relationships, yet holding her hand with her husband sufficed her need of love, the need of physical touch. The last love language is, of course, acts of service. Simply put, this means talk is cheap, show me your action. The husband can say to his wife 1,000,000 times, I love you. The wife replies, if you truly love me, help me with house chores. Here's the vacuum cleaner. I've done it, folks. The Bible puts it this way, let us love not in word or speech, but in truth and action. It also puts this way in the book of James, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? If a brother and sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? Acts of service. I'm going to present to you a couple of cases and I'll be through. Case number one, a pastor couple of 17 years of marriage. And their love languages are different, as you could imagine. The husband's love language was words of affirmation. The wife's love language was gifts. So after years of expressing their love for each other in their own love language, instead of the others, they always felt that something was missing in their marriage. For instance, to make her husband happy, the wife would buy gift after gift for him on every single special occasion, such as birthdays, anniversaries, and Valentine's Day, and Christmas, and so forth, right? Now, even matching neckties, her husband changing the clothes every Sunday, even matching neckties. Now, all those gifts without one single word affirmation. The husband always thought to himself that those gifts were a waste of money anyway. What about the other side? The husband believed that his wife needed words of affirmation, so he would tell her every single day how much she meant to him, how precious and beautiful she was, and so forth. Now, all the words of affirmation without buying one single gift. Now, such practices went on for 17 years. Then, one day, they realized their mistakes, speaking different love languages, so they started communicating in their spouse's love language this time rather than in their own. The wife now tells her husband how great the sermon was on each Sunday. Folks, by the way, when you go out, you can say the same thing to me, okay? The husband begins to get something special for his wife. Then their marriage has improved and they are still happily married. Case study number 2. I did it on my own family. In my family, my cat's love language is physical touch and food. My love language is words of affirmation. My wife's love language is acts of service. My daughter's is quality time. My daughter cherishes every moment we spend time together. She still talks about all the bedtime stories that I told her many nights when she was young, maybe 3 or 4 years old. She also remembers the times that we watched movies together with popcorns, of course. So folks, here are the action points for all of us. This week, take some time to analyze your loved one's complaints. Identify their love languages and start loving them in their love languages, not in your own, in order to fill up their emotional tanks. So, for your exercise, let's do some practice run here. Identify the love languages of each person following, okay? All examples, by the way, are taken from Costco's monthly magazine Connection. How many received that? Okay. All right, number 1. To the question of how do you let people know you love them? First one, whose name is Pat, says, I quote, I tell them I love them each time I talk with them. Life is too short to not let them know. What is the love language here? Words of affirmation, right? Second case, Patricia says, I quote, by cooking their favorite food and telling them every day that I love them. Oh, no. Food, what is that food? Gift. And telling them words of affirmation. Got it? Number 3, Tanaura says, I quote, I tell people all the time I love them. There's never a bad time to say it. I also share little gifts I pick up when I see something they might like. No special occasion required. There are 2 here. What are they? Gifts? Words of affirmation, isn't it? Number 4, David says, I quote, by being there for them through good and bad times. Quality time. You get it? Number 5, Ron says, I quote, I buy them Costco memberships. Gifts. So you got that? Okay, so you need to think of those things. What do they really please whenever I say, whatever I do, okay? One more. This is not from Costco magazine. Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Acts of service, isn't it? Action, right? By the way, you may discover that some people's love languages are more than one. And most of us have more than one love languages, like spending time and gifts and words of affirmation and so forth. That's just fine. Just begin with their primary one, okay? You can even ask your spouses or children, if you will. And do it out of a sincere and selfless heart. When you do it out of sincerity, before long, the recipients will appreciate your love for them, and they will start giving back their love to you. And you'll see the positive changes in your relationships. Let God be praised. Let's pause and pray.